James Hollifield is a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's Global Sustainability and Resilience Program and is also a professor of political science and director of the Tower Center at Southern Methodist University. Jim joins us again to talk about the ongoing migration crisis. Great to have you back. Welcome back.
Good to be back, John.
Jim, let me ask you about the latest developments. I know you've been on the road, like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby on the road to Morocco.
Yes, I was in Morocco, which is a critical state, as you know, a transition state, where they've actually solved some of the problems by, preventing thousands and thousands of people to transit through Morocco going to Spain, Europe, and beyond. So on that corner of the Mediterranean, things seem to be calm and quiet. And the Moroccans, I give them enormous credit on how they're dealing, with their own version of the migration crisis, with tens of thousands of sub-Saharan Africans who are sort of permanently stuck in Morocco. But if you go across the Mediterranean littoral, on the eastern end of it, that's where the crisis has been. And the Europeans have taken a number of short-term measures, and I emphasize short-term here, to try to stanch the flow, stop the exodus. And the Germans and the Europeans have struck a deal with the Turks because Turkey is critical to the short-term need to reduce the numbers and reestablish control of borders.
What is Morocco getting right, Jim, that maybe Europe can learn from?
Well, they have been very careful in coordinating, collaborating with the Spanish and with the EU, and basically sending a message to the people who are wanting to transit through Morocco that they can't do that they're not going to be able to reach their final destination. So, the critical thing here, and the Moroccans have solved this puzzle, is that these kinds of movements, that they have to be orderly and legal. And so the Europeans are struggling, to put in place a system that will allow them to process legitimate asylum seekers, closer to the points of origin, so that you don't have this sudden massive surge of people, which is dangerous for the migrants themselves, obviously, and destabilizing for the countries involved.
Has the debate evolved since last we spoke? Have the terms of how people are thinking about this evolved at all?
Oh, for sure. There was this great, understandable humanitarian impulse in the short term. The Germans saying, we can take all the Syrians and Iraqis who can get here. Of course, this led into the classic moral hazard problem, when you allow people to move and give them some prospect of getting there and staying there. Many, many more people are going to take advantage of this. So we saw that over half of the people, who jumped through the door were coming from very far afield. They were coming from East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, especially from South Asia. The Afghans were right behind the Iraqis and the Syrians. So the Germans and the Europeans have had to quickly backtrack from this initial policy to find a way to regain control. And as I said, the short-term solution to that is to get the Turks to help control the door of entry.
We've seen cracks in the European Union and over the years. Greece's struggles. Now the Brexit is front and center. It has its own name.
Yep.
How significant a stress is this creating for the EU as a whole, and is it potentially a straw that breaks the camel's back?
I would be careful about using dramatic metaphors.
It's a little melodramatic in my question.
It's a dramatic metaphor. Recently I had the privilege of having dinner with Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist, who predicted over a period of years that the euro would collapse, that the Europeans wouldn't be able to sustain their single currency. And he admitted that he was wrong about that because he didn't understand the enormous political commitment that the Europeans have to the European project. And I would say the same thing here. The idea that the Europeans are going to go back on, open Europe, open borders, freedom of movement within the European Union, which is a critical pillar of European integration. It's one of their greatest accomplishments. So I think you have to be careful. The Europeans have a lot invested in this, and they're going to go to great lengths to try to maintain this system. Now, it's true. If you add the refugee migration crisis to the euro crisis, and now the prospect of Brexit, the British leaving Europe, I think that is really the biggest short-term danger, because if a major state like Britain were to actually vote to leave the EU, that would cause a crisis. But I remain somewhat optimistic that the Europeans will eventually get a handle on the refugee and migration crisis.
We can't obviously ignore the politics and the policy and the big geopolitical questions, but I want to ask you about the human cost of this crisis.
Yeah.
Such a dangerous journey. I saw a statistic that almost 4,000 people died crossing the Mediterranean in 2015 alone.
Yep.
And now we're moving into the summer months where more people, more accidents. Talk to us about that and how much we might be missing as we look at that bigger picture.
Yeah. Well, again, this is part of the immediate, humanitarian disaster that the Europeans are facing. And the Europeans are committed to the Refugee Convention. So they're not going to turn their backs on this, and they will try to live up to their commitments. But this means that, people are going to continue to try to get to Europe. And as, the deal that they have struck with the Turks, which means Turkey being designated basically a safe third country. So, which means the Europeans can send people back to Turkey. And they've struck a deal to do that, so that and it has cut the flows dramatically, which means cutting the numbers of deaths, and it means pulling the rug out from under the people smugglers to some extent. Don't forget how critical they are in this. But that deal with the Turks is a very fragile deal. As we all know, the Turkish Prime Minister was recently sacked by the Turkish President. Whether that was a result of his dealings with the EU or not, we're not entirely sure. But as you begin to close off this route for people to come through the eastern Mediterranean and through the southeastern borders of Europe, my fear is that then you will see more people surging into Libya, which is essentially a failed state. And we'll go back to the system where people are trying to cross in these rickety, unseaworthy boats across central Mediterranean. And then you will see the deaths go up again. We recently saw hundreds of people perish, in an accident in which a boatload of refugees sank in the Mediterranean. So that is a very dangerous route. But it's one, unfortunately, that remains open to a lot of people.
A final thought, Jim, is back to the 30,000-foot view. Your project here at the Wilson Center, the Emerging Migration Stage, you've been immersed in this current events story almost as a journalist and more than an academic.
Right.
You've been traveling to the places. In the big picture, that 30,000, are things changing in the way you're thinking about this based on what you're encountering in the immediate story?
Well, not really. I think that
so the patterns are holding.
The patterns are there. The trends are there. This is not the first major refugee crisis that we've seen in Europe or elsewhere in the world. The world remains highly unequal. You've got tremendous supply push forces at work that lead people to want to move. Some are moving because they are opting to do that voluntarily, and of course we know that many others, up to 60 million people, are listed as people of concern by the UNHCR. These are people who are forced migrants. And the simple fact is that we have built, in the world that we live in today, quite a liberal order where we try to respect the rights of people, we try to allow markets to function at some level. That order has been under enormous stress now for decades. There's less of a consensus in the West, as we can see politically, both in Europe and in the United States, to support this liberal world order. So there's no question that the liberal order is under stress. But again, I would go back to what I said about the EU earlier. Don't underestimate how much investment we have in maintaining this order. Are we going to throw the Refugee Convention out the door? Are we going to suspend rights for foreigners and immigrants across the Western world? I don't think so.
Well, on that optimistic note, we will end. It's a pleasure to speak to you again. You're a great resource to have at the Wilson Center. It's been a pleasure, and we'll look forward to the next time.
John, I enjoy working with you and your colleagues very much.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.